In the dense swamplands of South Carolina, where Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds, and the air itself seems to whisper of forgotten sins, lies the crumbling remains of what locals once called the Angel's Rest Chapel. Between 1789 and 1832, over 200 souls vanished without a trace after seeking refuge at this supposed sanctuary. Church records discovered in 1923 and immediately sealed by authorities revealed meticulous documentation of systematic murder disguised as divine mercy. The Whitworth family, pillars of their community and operators of the mysterious Order of Fallen Angels, had turned their plantation chapel into the most profitable killing ground in the antebellum South. What you're about to hear has been buried for nearly 2 centuries. But the truth about America's most sinister religious family can no longer remain hidden. Before we unveil the horrifying depths of the Whitworth legacy, this story isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to face the darkest chapters of American history. If you're ready to join our community of true mystery seekers, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We need to know how far these dark secrets are traveling. Now let's step back into the shadows of 1789 South Carolina, where salvation came with a price no soul should ever pay. But understanding how such calculated evil could flourish requires us to examine the world that created the Whitworth dynasty. The year was 1789, and the newly formed United States was still bleeding from the wounds of revolution. In the low country of South Carolina, where rice plantations stretched endlessly toward the Atlantic, the social order remained as rigid as the tides that flooded the coastal marshes twice daily. It was here, 30 miles inland from Charleston, that the Whitworth family had carved out their empire of deception. Gabriel Whitworth was 43 years old when he purchased the 1,000-acre tract he would name Seraphim's Grace. Standing 6 feet tall with prematurely silver hair and eyes the color of winter ice, Gabriel possessed the kind of commanding presence that made lesser men step aside when he entered a room. His voice, cultured and resonant, could fill a chapel or reduce a grown man to trembling silence with equal ease. Born into Virginia's declining planter aristocracy, Gabriel had watched his family's tobacco fortune crumble during the Revolutionary War. But where others saw ruin, Gabriel saw opportunity. His wife, Constance Whitworth Knapton, came from old Charleston money, her family's wealth built on the slave trade and rice cultivation. At 38, Constance remained beautiful in a fragile, ethereal way that reminded visitors of porcelain dolls. Her dark hair was always perfectly arranged, and her pale hands never showed the calluses of honest work. But those who looked closely into her brown eyes saw something troubling, a kind of vacant distance, as if part of her mind had retreated to a place where the horrors around her couldn't reach. The Whitworth children were each remarkable in their own disturbing way. Ezekiel, 24, and the heir apparent, possessed his father's calculating intelligence, but with an added cruelty that even Gabriel sometimes found unsettling. Tall and lean like his father, Ezekiel's smile never quite reached his dark eyes. He had studied briefly at the College of Charleston before his father recalled him to manage the family's more delicate operations. Miriam, 22, was perhaps the most dangerous of all the Whitworth offspring. Where her brothers used force and intimidation, Miriam employed charm and manipulation. She could make a desperate runaway feel completely safe while leading them directly to their death. Her beauty was conventional, golden hair, blue eyes, a sweet smile. But there was something in her manner that suggested she found genuine pleasure in others' suffering. The twins, Cain and Abel, had just turned 20. Cain was the larger of the two, with broad shoulders and hands that looked capable of strangling a man. Abel was slighter, more thoughtful, but his intelligence was focused entirely on devising new methods of extracting information from unwilling subjects. The boys had been raised to see themselves as instruments of divine justice, and they approached their work with the methodical precision of craftsmen. Young Lilith, only 16, was still developing her role in the family enterprise. Blonde like her sister, but with her father's piercing gaze, she possessed an unsettling maturity that made visitors uncomfortable. Gabriel was grooming her to take over Miriam's duties when the time came. The family business, after all, required continuity. Gabriel's brother, Michael Whitworth, served as the plantation's official overseer and Gabriel's closest collaborator. 2 years younger than Gabriel, Michael had the weathered look of a man who spent his days in the field. But his education matched his brother's. He understood that their operation required both brutality and careful record-keeping. Michael's wife, Ruth, had died in childbirth 5 years earlier, leaving him to raise their twin daughters, Mercy and Grace, now 13. The girls lived in the main house with their cousins, receiving the same careful education in the family's particular brand of theology. The youngest brother, Raphael Whitworth, who insisted everyone call him Seraph, was 35 and perhaps the most chilling member of the family. Thin to the point of appearing gaunt with prematurely white hair and pale green eyes, Seraph had studied medicine at Edinburgh before the Revolution. His medical knowledge made him invaluable to the family's operations, though he had never practiced legitimate medicine. Instead, he used his skills to keep victims alive longer during interrogations, and to ensure that the bodies they eventually sold to medical schools appeared to have died from natural causes. The Whitworth plantation itself was perfectly designed for their sinister purposes. The main house, the imposing 3-story Georgian structure, sat on a slight rise overlooking the rice fields, but it was the smaller buildings that served the family's true business. The chapel, completed in 1788, stood half a mile from the main house, connected by a path that wound through a grove of ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss. The building was larger than most plantation chapels, with room for 200 worshippers, though the Whitworth congregation rarely exceeded 50 locals. What made the chapel unique were the modifications Gabriel had ordered during construction. The basement, accessed through a hidden door behind the altar, had been designed as a series of holding cells. The walls were thick enough to muffle screams, and the ventilation system ensured that occupants could be kept alive for extended periods. Adjacent to the chapel stood what appeared to be a simple outbuilding used for storing religious materials. In reality, it housed Seraph's medical laboratory and the tools of his trade. The family had established their Order of Fallen Angels in 1789, presenting it to the local community as a Methodist revival movement focused on bringing salvation to the most desperate souls. They held regular services, inviting neighboring planters and their families to witness Gabriel's passionate sermons about redemption through suffering. The local Methodist circuit rider, Reverend Thomas Hartwell, initially welcomed the Whitworth's religious enthusiasm, even allowing Gabriel to conduct special services for seekers in spiritual distress. But the order's true purpose was far more sinister. Through a network of contacts in Charleston, Savannah, and as far north as Richmond, the Whitworths spread carefully crafted rumors about their chapel. Word reached slave quarters throughout the region that Angel's Rest was a sanctuary where runaways could find food, shelter, and guidance to freedom. The stories were specific enough to be believable. Detailed descriptions of the chapel's location, passwords to identify genuine seekers, and testimonials from supposed escapees who had successfully reached the north. The elaborate deception required careful coordination. Seraph maintained correspondence with medical schools in Charleston, Savannah, Richmond, and even Philadelphia, establishing himself as a reliable supplier of cadavers for anatomical study. The bodies were always presented as those of free persons of color who had died of natural causes, complete with forged documentation. Medical schools in the early Republic asked few questions about the source of their specimens, and Seraph's prices were always reasonable. Michael handled the practical aspects of the operation, managing the legitimate plantation business that provided cover for their activities, maintaining the network of informants who spread word about the sanctuary, and coordinating with professional slave catchers who helped identify the most valuable targets. The family's legitimate rice plantation was moderately successful, employing nearly 100 enslaved workers who lived in relative comfort compared to other plantations. This benevolent reputation was carefully cultivated, with Gabriel allowing his workers better food, housing, and even limited movement around the plantation. The most diabolical aspect of the Whitworth operation was how they used genuine religious faith as a weapon. Gabriel's sermons were powerful and moving, filled with biblical references and theological sophistication that impressed even educated listeners. He truly believed that he was doing God's work, convinced that the souls he sent to their deaths were predestined for damnation anyway. This theological framework allowed the entire family to participate in mass murder while maintaining their sense of moral superiority. Local authorities knew something unusual was happening at Seraphim's Grace, but the Whitworths had been careful to establish themselves as pillars of the community. Gabriel served on the county commission, contributed generously to local churches, and hosted elaborate social gatherings that cemented his family's place in planter society. When occasional questions arose about missing slaves or strangers seen in the area, the Whitworths expressed appropriate concern and offered to help with searches. The autumn of 1791 brought unusual activity to Seraphim's Grace. A series of devastating storms had damaged crops throughout the low country, creating economic hardship that drove more enslaved people to attempt escape. For the Whitworths, this represented unprecedented opportunity. In a single month, 43 desperate souls arrived at Angel's Rest Chapel seeking sanctuary. It was during this period that the family's methods became most refined. Ezekiel had developed a system for categorizing new arrivals based on their potential value. Young, healthy males were kept alive longest, as their information about plantation defenses and escape routes proved most valuable to professional slave catchers. Women with children were questioned about other families planning to escape, their desperation making them particularly forthcoming. Older escapes, who typically knew less useful information, were dispatched quickly to minimize resources spent on their maintenance. The process always began the same way. New arrivals were greeted by Miriam, whose gentle manner and obvious education made her seem like an angel of mercy. She would provide food, clean clothing, and a safe place to rest while explaining that the family needed to verify their stories before helping them continue north. This waiting period, she explained, was necessary to protect both the escapees and the Underground Railroad network. During these first days, the Whitworths gathered intelligence through seemingly casual conversation. Miriam excelled at drawing out information about families left behind, planned meeting points, and contacts in the north. Gabriel would visit the chapel daily, conducting prayer services that gradually revealed more about each person's background and connections. The twins, Cain and Abel, posed as runaway slaves from other plantations, sharing fabricated stories of successful escapes to build trust and encourage more detailed confessions. Once the family had extracted all useful information, the victims were moved to the chapel's basement. Seraph's medical training proved invaluable here, as he could keep subjects conscious and responsive far longer than crude torture methods would allow. The basement contained 5 individual cells, each equipped with shackles and designed to prevent any possibility of escape. Soundproofing was so effective that the chapel's regular congregation, meeting directly above, never heard the suffering below. The interrogation process typically lasted 3 to 5 days. Seraph used his knowledge of human anatomy to inflict maximum pain while avoiding permanent damage that might affect the eventual sale of the body. He had developed a detailed understanding of pressure points, nerve pathways, and psychological techniques that broke resistance without leaving obvious marks. Abel assisted with these sessions, taking careful notes about information revealed and cross-referencing details with previous victims' testimonies. What made the Whitworth operation particularly effective was their systematic approach to record-keeping. Gabriel maintained detailed ledgers documenting every aspect of their business. Each victim was assigned a number and had a complete file including physical description, background information, intelligence gathered, and ultimate disposition. These records allowed the family to track patterns in escape routes, identify key figures in the Underground Railroad, and provide valuable intelligence to their network of professional slave catchers. The family had established partnerships with 3 major slave-catching operations covering territory from Virginia to Georgia. These professional bounty hunters paid premium prices for detailed information about escape routes, safe houses, and planned flights. A single successful raid based on Whitworth intelligence could net rewards of thousands of dollars, money that was split between the family and their criminal partners. But it was the body trade that provided the most consistent profits. Serif's connections with medical schools had grown into a sophisticated supply network. Bodies were preserved using techniques he had learned in Edinburgh, packaged in specially designed containers and shipped with forged documentation identifying them as free persons of color who had died of natural causes. The family earned between $50 and $100 per body depending on the specimen's condition and the receiving institution's needs. Young Lilith began participating in the family business during this period, initially serving as an additional friendly face to greet new arrivals. Her youth and apparent innocence made desperate people even more trusting. Gabriel was pleased to see that she showed no emotional reaction to the suffering around her, suggesting that she would be able to take on greater responsibilities as she matured. The most horrifying aspect of the operation was how the family maintained their public facade. Every Sunday they attended services at the local Methodist church where Gabriel often served as a lay preacher. They hosted elaborate dinner parties, contributed to charity drives, and participated in all the social activities expected of prominent planters. Constance became known for her beautiful needlework and her skill at organizing ladies' auxiliary functions. By 1795, the Whitworth operation had grown beyond anything Gabriel had originally envisioned. What began as an opportunistic scheme to profit from the chaos of the early republic had evolved into a sophisticated criminal enterprise spanning 4 states. The family's success had attracted the attention of other like-minded individuals, leading to the formation of what they called the Southern Redemption Society. The society's membership included plantation owners, merchants, professional slave catchers, corrupt officials, and even a few ministers who shared Gabriel's twisted theology. Monthly meetings were held at rotating locations, usually disguised as religious revivals or social gatherings. Members paid dues based on their profits from society-related activities, and these funds were used to expand operations and corrupt officials who might otherwise interfere. Dr. Edmund Thorne, who ran a medical practice in Charleston, became one of the society's most valuable members. His legitimate medical credentials allowed him to provide death certificates for the bodies Serif supplied to medical schools. Thorne also had connections with ship captains who transported specimens to northern institutions, ensuring that the supply chain remained undetected by authorities. Captain Marcus Fulton controlled a network of professional slave catchers operating throughout the Carolinas and Georgia. His men specialized in tracking down specific individuals based on intelligence provided by the Whitworths. Fulton's operation was particularly brutal, often capturing entire families when they learned of planned escapes. The captain paid the Whitworths a percentage of all rewards collected using their information. Perhaps most disturbing was the participation of Reverend Josiah Blackwood, a Methodist minister whose territory included 3 counties in eastern South Carolina. Blackwood used his position to identify potential escapees within his congregation, passing information to the Whitworths while maintaining the appearance of pastoral concern. He even conducted funeral services for some of the family's victims using forged documentation to claim they had died of fever or other natural causes. The society's growth required more sophisticated methods of operation. Gabriel developed a coded communication system that allowed members to share information without risk of detection. Letters discussing spiritual matters and redemption work contained detailed intelligence about escape routes, safe houses, and planned flights. This coded correspondence was discovered years later, providing historians with detailed documentation of the network's scope and methods. Seraph's role evolved during this period from simple torturer to what would now be recognized as a forensic analyst. He developed detailed profiles of escape patterns, identifying the most commonly used routes and the seasonal variations in flight attempts. This intelligence allowed the society to position resources more effectively, intercepting escapees before they could reach genuine safe houses. The family's chapel became a training ground for new society members. Gabriel conducted special seminars on theological justification for difficult decisions, teaching participants how to rationalize their actions through selective biblical interpretation. SIF provided medical training showing attendees how to extract information without leaving obvious evidence of torture. Even Miriam contributed, teaching manipulation techniques that made victims more cooperative. During this expansion period, the Whitworths processed an average of 60 victims. Per year, the chapel's basement was enlarged to accommodate 12 cells, and additional soundproofing was installed. A new crematorium disguised as a pottery kiln was constructed to dispose of remains that couldn't be profitably sold to medical schools. The family employed 6 additional workers, all society members, to handle the increased volume of their operations. Young Lilith, now 18, had become fully integrated into the family business. Her specialty was handling female victims, particularly those traveling with children. She had developed a maternal persona that made desperate mothers trust her completely. Lilith would care for children while their parents were being interrogated, sometimes using threats against the young ones to encourage cooperation. Her complete lack of empathy combined with her nurturing appearance made her perhaps the most effective member of the family. The twins, Cain and Abel, had developed complementary specialties. Cain handled the physical aspects of the operation, maintaining the facilities, managing transportation, and disposing of evidence. Abel focused on intelligence analysis, maintaining the detailed records that made the operation so profitable. Together, they had created a system efficient enough to process victims within 48 hours of arrival, maximizing profits while minimizing risks. But the society's success was drawing unwanted attention. Abolitionists in the North had begun noticing patterns in the disappearances of escaped slaves. Several newspaper articles mentioned the unusual number of runaways who seemed to vanish completely after leaving plantations in the South Carolina Low Country. Underground Railroad conductors reported losing contact with escapees who had been directed to safe houses in the region. The winter of 1798 brought an unexpected visitor to the South Carolina Low Country. Jeremiah Morrison, a Quaker merchant from Philadelphia, arrived in Charleston under the pretense of establishing trade relationships with local rice planters. In reality, Morrison was conducting a covert investigation for the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, trying to determine why so many escaped slaves who had successfully reached the Mason-Dixon line reported losing friends and family members somewhere in South Carolina. Morrison was a careful man, 45 years old, with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent years in dangerous places. His Quaker faith had driven him to risk his life multiple times helping escapees reach freedom, and he had developed an intuitive sense for detecting deception. Something about the stories coming out of South Carolina didn't feel right to him. The investigation began with Morrison interviewing successful escapees in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Pattern after pattern emerged from their testimonies. Many had been told about a sanctuary called Angel's Rest where they could find food and guidance. Some had actually visited the chapel but left quickly, reporting that something felt wrong about the place. Others had sent friends or family members there only to never hear from them again. Morrison spent weeks documenting these accounts, cross-referencing locations, dates, and descriptions. The pattern was clear. People were disappearing at a specific location in the South Carolina Lowcountry. But proving what was happening required someone to infiltrate the operation, and Morrison knew that his skin color made him unsuitable for such a mission. The solution came from an unexpected source. Samuel Washington, a free black man from Baltimore who had been educated in Pennsylvania, volunteered to pose as an escaped slave seeking passage north. Washington was light-skinned enough to potentially pass for mixed race, which might explain his education and refined manner. More importantly, he was utterly fearless, having already conducted similar investigations in Virginia and Maryland. Washington arrived in Charleston in March 1799, carrying forged documents identifying him as the property of a fictional Virginia planter. He spent several weeks working as a day laborer, quietly gathering information about local Underground Railroad contacts. It didn't take long for him to hear whispers about the sanctuary at Angel's Rest Chapel. The approach was gradual and careful. Washington made contact with other people seeking to escape, allowing word of his situation to spread naturally through the underground network. Within a month, he was approached by a contact who provided directions to the Whitworth plantation and the passwords needed to identify himself as a legitimate seeker. Morrison, meanwhile, had established himself in Charleston's business community, using his legitimate merchant credentials to gain access to shipping records, medical college, correspondence, and other documents that might reveal the scope of whatever criminal enterprise was operating in the region. His Quaker connections in Philadelphia had provided him with names of medical professors who might be receiving suspicious specimens. What Morrison discovered shocked even his experienced mind. Shipping records showed regular deliveries from South Carolina to medical schools throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. The volume was far too high to represent normal mortality among the region's free black population. Death certificates provided by local physicians showed suspicious patterns. Too many deaths from fever and natural causes among people described as transient free blacks. Washington's mission began on a humid April evening when he approached Angel's Rest Chapel following the instructions he had received. The building appeared exactly as described, larger than most plantation chapels with Gothic windows that seemed oddly foreboding in the fading light. Spanish moss hung from the surrounding oaks like funeral shrouds, and the air was thick with the smell of stagnant water from nearby rice fields. Miriam Whitworth greeted him at the chapel door, her smile warm and welcoming. She was exactly as beautiful as the stories had suggested, with golden hair and eyes that seemed to radiate compassion. Washington felt an immediate sense of danger. Something about her perfect performance struck him as rehearsed, as if she had done this many times before. "You must be so tired, poor soul," Miriam said, leading him inside the chapel. "Come, let me get you some food and a safe place to rest. Tomorrow we'll discuss your journey north." The chapel's interior was more elaborate than Washington had expected. The stained glass windows depicted scenes of divine judgment that seemed unusually violent for a Methodist sanctuary. The altar was carved from dark wood, and behind it hung a painting of the Archangel Michael casting demons into hell. Everything about the space felt theatrical, as if designed to inspire fear rather than comfort. Washington was provided with simple food and clean clothes, then shown to a small room adjacent to the chapel where he could spend the night. Miriam explained that the family needed to verify his story before helping him continue north, a precaution necessary to protect both him and their network. This waiting period, she assured him, rarely lasted more than a few days. During his second day at the plantation, Washington met other members of the Whitworth family. Gabriel appeared every bit the benevolent patriarch, conducting prayer services and offering spiritual guidance to the desperate souls seeking refuge. His sermons were powerful and moving, filled with references to liberation and redemption that seemed perfectly suited to his audience. But Washington's trained eye began noticing troubling details. The other guests at the plantation seemed unusually subdued, speaking in whispers and avoiding eye contact. When he tried to engage them in conversation about their backgrounds or travel plans, they provided vague, inconsistent answers. Most disturbing was the way they looked at the Whitworth family members with a mixture of gratitude and terror that suggested they knew more than they were saying. On his third night, Washington was awakened by sounds that made his blood run cold. Muffled screams were coming from somewhere beneath the chapel, barely audible through the thick walls but unmistakably human. He lay perfectly still, listening to the agonized cries until they finally stopped just before dawn. When he mentioned the sounds to other guests the next morning, they claimed to have heard nothing. Washington realized that he was in mortal danger, but he also understood that he might be the only person who could expose this operation. He began making careful observations, noting the layout of buildings, the number of family members, and the patterns of activity around the plantation. Most importantly, he started looking for evidence of what was happening to the people who arrived at Angel's Rest, but never left. The breakthrough came when Washington observed Seraph Whitworth loading a wagon with what appeared to be wooden crates. The crates were the right size and shape to contain human bodies, and they were being loaded with the careful attention typically reserved for valuable cargo. Washington followed the wagon from a distance, watching as it traveled to a landing on the Ashley River, where a small steamboat was waiting. But Washington had been observed as well. Abel Whitworth had noticed his curious behavior and reported it to his father. Gabriel decided that their guest was becoming too inquisitive and ordered his transfer to the chapel basement. Washington's investigation was about to become a personal fight for survival. Washington's descent into the chapel basement revealed the true scope of the Whitworth family's evil. The underground facility was far more sophisticated than he had imagined, with 12 individual cells, a medical laboratory, and what appeared to be a crematorium. The smell of death hung in the air like a physical presence, and the walls bore stains that no amount of cleaning could remove. He was placed in a cell that showed evidence of previous occupants. Scratches in the stone walls were desperate. Fingernails had tried to claw through solid rock, and darker stains that Washington didn't want to identify. The cell was barely large enough for him to lie down, with no furniture except a bucket for waste and a small opening near the ceiling that provided minimal ventilation. Within hours of his imprisonment, Washington heard other prisoners in nearby cells. Their whispered conversations revealed the full horror of what was happening. Some had been there for weeks, kept alive only long enough to provide information about escape routes, underground railroad contacts, and other planned flights. Others were newer arrivals who still held hope that they might be released. The interrogations began immediately. Seraph Whitworth proved to be a methodical torturer, using his medical knowledge to inflict maximum pain while avoiding permanent damage that might affect the eventual sale of the body. He worked with surgical precision, asking detailed questions about underground railroad operations while applying carefully calculated physical pressure. Washington's education and obvious intelligence made him particularly valuable to the Whitworths. They suspected he might be connected to abolitionists in the North, and they were determined to extract information about Underground Railroad financing and organization. The torture sessions lasted hours, with Sharif demonstrating a disturbing enthusiasm for his work, but Washington had been prepared for this possibility. His training in Philadelphia had included instruction on resisting interrogation, and his Quaker faith provided him with inner strength that his captives couldn't break. He fed them false information mixed with enough truth to seem credible, buying time, while he looked for an opportunity to escape. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. Grace Whitworth, one of Michael's 13-year-old twin daughters, had been bringing food to the prisoners as part of her education in the family business. Unlike her relatives, Grace seemed genuinely disturbed by the suffering around her. Washington began talking with her during these brief visits, gradually building her trust while planting seeds of doubt about her family's activities. Grace was intelligent enough to understand that what her family was doing was wrong, but she had been raised to believe that their victims were predestined for damnation. Anyway, Washington's gentle theological arguments, combined with his obvious education and refinement, began to shake her faith in the family's twisted doctrine. More importantly, she began to see him as a human being rather than simply another specimen for processing. The escape plan required careful timing and considerable luck. Grace agreed to leave Washington's cell unlocked during her next food delivery, giving him access to the laboratory where Sharif kept his surgical instruments. Armed with a scalpel, Washington would have to make his way through the plantation at night, avoiding the family and their workers while reaching the Ashley River where he could steal a boat. But the plan went wrong almost immediately. Grace's unusual behavior had been noticed by her sister Mercy, who reported the suspicious activity to their father, Michael. When Washington tried to leave his cell, he found Abel Whitworth waiting for him with a pistol and a vicious smile. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" Abel asked, gesturing for Washington to return to his cell. "Poor little Grace thought she was saving your soul. Instead, she's just ensured that your death will be much more unpleasant than we originally planned." Washington was returned to his cell, but the failed escape attempt had revealed something important. There were cracks in the family's unity. Grace's willingness to help him suggested that other family members might be having doubts about their activities. More importantly, the incident had forced the Whitworths to accelerate their timeline for his disposal. That night, Washington heard voices in the laboratory. Gabriel and Sharif discussing the best way to handle their problematic prisoner. Gabriel wanted to extract as much information as possible before killing him. But Sharif was concerned that Washington's obvious intelligence and education made him too dangerous to keep alive much longer. They decided to conduct one final interrogation session using methods that would likely prove fatal. But Washington had one more card to play. During his weeks of captivity, he had been making careful mental notes about everything he observed. The layout of the facility, the names and faces of family members, the details of their operation. More importantly, he had been memorizing the information provided by other prisoners, building a comprehensive picture of the Underground Railroad network that the Whitworths were systematically destroying. When Sharif arrived for the final interrogation, Washington offered to provide detailed information about abolitionist financing and organization in exchange for a quick death rather than prolonged torture. The offer was compelling enough to make Sharif pause and consider. He knew that such intelligence would be enormously valuable to their Southern Redemption Society partners. What Sharif didn't realize was that Washington was buying time for a rescue attempt. Jeremiah Morrison, growing concerned about his partner's extended absence, had begun making discreet inquiries about Angel's Rest Chapel. His investigation had attracted the attention of other abolitionists in Charleston, including several free black workers who had heard rumors about the plantation's activities. The rescue came at dawn on a humid June morning when fog from the Ashley River provided perfect cover for Morrison's small team of volunteers. They had spent weeks planning the assault, studying the plantation's layout, and identifying the most likely location for Washington's imprisonment. The team included Morrison, 2 other Quakers from Philadelphia, and 4 free black men from Charleston who had volunteered for the dangerous mission. The attack began with a diversionary fire set in one of the plantation's rice processing buildings. While the Whitworth family and their workers rushed to contain the blaze, Morrison's team infiltrated the chapel and discovered the entrance to the basement facility. What they found there exceeded their worst fears. 11 prisoners were still alive in the underground cells, including Washington, who was barely conscious after his final interrogation session. The laboratory contained detailed records of the family's activities, ledgers documenting over 800 murders, correspondence with medical schools throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, and maps showing underground railroad routes that had been compromised by information extracted from victims. But the most horrifying discovery was Sarif's medical journal, which contained detailed descriptions of his torture techniques and observations about the effectiveness of different methods. For extracting information, the journal revealed that he had been using the prisoners as test subjects for what he called enhanced interrogation research, systematically documenting the physical and psychological limits of human endurance. The rescue team had planned to escape immediately after freeing the prisoners, but Washington insisted on gathering as much evidence as possible. Despite his injuries, he helped collect the most incriminating documents while Morrison's men prepared the survivors for transport. They had perhaps 30 minutes before the fire would be controlled and the family would discover their underground chamber had been breached. The evidence they collected would eventually expose not only the Whitworth family's crimes, but the entire Southern Redemption Society network. Letters between society members revealed similar operations in Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia, all following the same basic model of false sanctuaries that lured escapees to their deaths. The scope of the conspiracy extended far beyond anything Morrison had imagined. But Gabriel Whitworth had not built his empire by being careless. When the fire was finally controlled and he realized what had happened, he immediately began implementing contingency plans that he had developed for exactly this situation. The family had escape routes prepared, and more importantly, they had powerful allies who would help them avoid prosecution. The Whitworths' political connections proved their salvation. Gabriel had spent years cultivating relationships with judges, sheriffs, and state legislators who owed their positions to planter support. When Morrison's evidence was presented to local authorities, it was dismissed as fabricated propaganda designed to inflame tensions between North and South. The few officials who took the accusation seriously found themselves facing intense pressure from their political patrons. Federal authorities in Charleston were more receptive to Morrison's evidence, but they lacked jurisdiction over crimes committed entirely within South Carolina. The Constitution's guarantee of state sovereignty over internal affairs meant that federal prosecutors could not pursue cases against South Carolina citizens without state cooperation. That cooperation was never forthcoming. Most frustrating for Morrison was the reaction of the local Methodist church hierarchy. Despite overwhelming evidence of the Whitworths' crimes, church leaders were reluctant to condemn a family that had contributed so generously to religious causes. Reverend Hartwell, the circuit rider who had originally welcomed Gabriel's ministry, claimed that the accusations were part of a northern conspiracy to discredit Southern Christianity. The Whitworth family used this breathing space to relocate their operation. Within 6 months of Morrison's raid, they had sold Seraphim's Grace Plantation and moved west to Alabama, where territorial status provided even less oversight than South Carolina's state government. They established a new plantation near Mobile, complete with another chapel and another underground facility. But Morrison's investigation had damaged the Southern Redemption Society's network beyond repair. Several key members, fearing exposure, abandoned the conspiracy and destroyed their records. Dr. Thorne fled to the Caribbean. Captain Fulton disappeared entirely, and Reverend Blackwood suddenly found religion and began preaching genuinely about the evils of slavery. Washington's testimony, combined with the evidence collected from the chapel basement, was published in abolitionist newspapers throughout the North. The detailed accounts of systematic torture and murder conducted under the guise of religious ministry shocked even hardened activists. The Whitworth case became a rallying cry for the growing abolitionist movement, proving that slavery's defenders would resort to any means to protect their interests. The Whitworth family's relocation to Alabama marked a new phase in their criminal enterprise. The territorial government provided even less oversight than South Carolina, and the rapid influx of settlers created perfect conditions for their false sanctuary operation. They established their new plantation, New Seraphim, 20 miles north of Mobile, where the Tum River provided convenient access to shipping routes. Gabriel had learned from the Charleston experience that maintaining political connections was essential for long-term survival. He immediately began cultivating relationships with territorial officials, contributing generously to their campaigns, and hosting elaborate social events that cemented his family's place in Alabama society. Within 2 years, he had been appointed to the Territorial Council, giving him direct influence over law enforcement policies. The new chapel was even more sophisticated than its South Carolina predecessor. Gabriel had hired an architect from New Orleans who designed a structure that appeared to be a conventional Methodist church, while concealing an underground complex capable of holding 30 prisoners simultaneously. The facility included improved soundproofing, better ventilation, and a medical laboratory that surpassed anything Serif had previously operated. But the family's methods had evolved as well. The failure in Charleston had taught them that relying entirely on false sanctuaries was too risky. They began developing multiple approaches to their criminal enterprise, including legitimate slave trading that provided cover for their more sinister activities. Gabriel obtained a license as a slave trader, allowing him to transport and sell human beings legally while using the business to identify potential victims for his underground operation. The legitimate slave trading business proved enormously profitable and provided perfect cover for their criminal activities. Gabriel specialized in what he called problem slaves, individuals who had attempted escape, shown signs of rebellion, or possessed skills that made them particularly valuable. These slaves commanded premium prices. But more importantly, their disappearance could be easily explained as routine sales to distant plantations. Ezekiel had developed a particularly sinister innovation during the Alabama years. He began purchasing slaves specifically to torture information from them about underground railroad networks, then selling them to plantations so remote that escape was virtually impossible. This approach generated revenue while still providing the intelligence that made their false sanctuary operation so profitable. The family's network in Alabama proved even more extensive than their South Carolina connections. The territorial government was dominated by settlers from Georgia and the Carolinas, many of whom shared the Whitworth's views about the necessity of extreme measures to maintain social order. Several prominent planters became informal partners in the operation, providing intelligence about potential escapees and sharing in the profits from successful captures. Miriam had married Captain James Patterson, a former naval officer who commanded a riverboat on the Tumby. Patterson's vessel, the Sweet Salvation, became an essential component of the family's transportation network. Bodies destined for medical schools were shipped north via riverboat, while living captives were transported to remote locations where they could be held indefinitely without discovery. Young Lilith, now 22, had become the family's most effective operative. Her beauty and apparent innocence made her irresistible to men of all social classes. and she used these advantages to gather intelligence about escape plans, abolitionist activities, and underground railroad operations. She had established relationships with boat captains, merchants, and even federal officials, each believing that he was her only romantic interest. The twins, Cain and Abel, had developed complementary criminal enterprises that supported the family's main operation. Cain operated a blacksmith shop in Mobile that specialized in restraints and transportation equipment used by slave traders throughout the region. Abel had established himself as a dealer in curious medical specimens, providing anatomical oddities to medical schools and private collectors in the North and Europe. But it was Sharif's medical research that represented the most chilling evolution of the family's activities. His years of experience torturing prisoners had given him unprecedented knowledge of human anatomy and psychology. He began conducting what he called enhanced medical research, using prisoners as test subjects for procedures that no legitimate physician would attempt. His detailed journals from this period, discovered decades later, revealed experiments that anticipated some of the worst medical crimes of the 20th century. The Alabama operation processed an average of 80 victims per year, making it the most prolific component of what remained of the Southern Redemption Society network. The underground facility beneath New Seraphim's Chapel could hold 30 prisoners simultaneously, allowing for more systematic extraction of intelligence and more efficient processing of bodies for sale to medical institutions. By 1805, word of the Whitworth family's Alabama operation had begun reaching abolitionist networks in the North. Jeremiah Morrison, still haunted by his experiences in South Carolina, had spent years tracking the family's movements and documenting their continued activities. His detailed reports to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society painted a picture of systematic murder that exceeded anything previously documented in American criminal history. Morrison's investigation had attracted the attention of federal authorities in Washington, where Secretary of State James Madison was growing concerned about reports of criminal enterprises that threatened to destabilize relationships between northern and southern states. The Whitworth case had become a symbol of the extremes to which slavery's defenders would go, and its exposure was generating political pressure that Madison found increasingly difficult to ignore. But investigating crimes committed in territorial Alabama proved even more challenging than pursuing the family in South Carolina. The territorial government was dominated by Southern interests, and federal authority was limited to specific constitutional violations. Unless Morrison could prove that the Whitworths were interfering with interstate commerce or violating federal treaties, local authorities could continue ignoring the evidence against them. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Samuel Washington, still recovering from his traumatic imprisonment in the Charleston facility, had spent years developing a network of informants within the slave trading community. His contacts included boat captains, warehouse workers, and even some plantation overseers who had grown disgusted with the extreme brutality they witnessed. This network provided detailed intelligence about the Whitworth family's Alabama operations. Washington learned that the family was planning a major expansion of their activities. Gabriel had negotiated agreements with medical schools in New Orleans, Richmond, and even Boston to provide a steady supply of anatomical specimens. The volume of bodies required for these contracts would necessitate killing nearly 200 people per year, making the Alabama operation the largest murder for-profit enterprise in American history. More importantly, Washington's informants revealed that the family was planning to recruit additional partners throughout the Deep South. Gabriel had been conducting secret meetings with planters in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee, spreading his model of false sanctuaries combined with legitimate slave trading. If successful, this expansion would create a network of killing sites that could process thousands of victims annually. Morrison realized that traditional law enforcement approaches would never stop the Whitworth network. Local authorities were either corrupted, intimidated, or genuinely sympathetic to the family's activities. Federal intervention remained unlikely unless the crimes could be framed as threats to national security. The only realistic option was direct action by abolitionist networks, despite the enormous legal and physical risks involved. The plan that emerged from Morrison's discussions with other abolitionists was both audacious and dangerous. A team of volunteers would infiltrate the Alabama operation, gathering evidence while simultaneously conducting rescue operations. The information collected would be used to expose not only the Whitworth family but their entire network of partners and customers. Most importantly, the operation would be timed to coincide with a major gathering of Southern Redemption Society members, allowing for the capture of multiple criminal leaders simultaneously. Washington insisted on leading the infiltration team despite Morrison's concerns about his psychological readiness for such a mission. The torture he had endured in Charleston had left permanent scars, both physical and mental, but it had also given him unique insights into the family's methods and psychology. No one else possessed his combination of experience, intelligence, and desperate motivation to stop their activities. The team assembled for the Alabama mission included 12 volunteers from abolitionist organizations throughout the North. Several were Quakers like Morrison, motivated by religious convictions about human equality. Others were free black men who understood that their own freedom depended on destroying the networks that made escape impossible for their enslaved brothers and sisters. All were prepared to die rather than allow the Whitworth operation to continue. The infiltration of the Alabama operation began in the autumn of 1807 when Washington and 3 other team members arrived in Mobile posing as slave traders from Georgia. Their cover story was carefully constructed with forged documents and references from fictional plantations that would be difficult to verify. Washington's light skin and education allowed him to pose as a mixed-race freeman working as an agent for white traders, while his companions played the roles of typical Southern businessmen seeking profitable investments. The team spent weeks establishing their credentials within Mobile's slave trading community. They attended auctions, visited plantations, and gradually built relationships with the merchants and traders who formed the backbone of the regional economy. Their ultimate goal was to arrange a meeting with Gabriel Whitworth, whose reputation as a specialist in difficult cases had spread throughout the territory. Morrison, meanwhile, had established himself in New Orleans, where he used his legitimate merchant credentials to investigate the medical schools that were receiving specimens from Alabama. His discoveries were even more horrifying than expected. Not only were the schools receiving far more bodies than could be explained by natural mortality, but some professors were specifically requesting specimens that showed evidence of particular types of trauma. The academic medical community was not merely ignoring the source of their specimens. They were actively encouraging the torture that preceded death. The meeting with Gabriel finally occurred in December 1807. When Washington's team was invited to New Seraphim Plantation to discuss potential business arrangements, Gabriel appeared to be thriving in Alabama, having gained weight and developed the kind of confident bearing that came from years of successful criminality. His family had grown as well. Miriam was pregnant with her second child. Ezekiel had married a local planter's daughter, and even young Lilith was engaged to a territorial judge's son. The plantation itself was far more impressive than Seraphim's Grace had been. The main house was a massive Georgian structure with elaborate gardens and outbuildings that rivaled the finest estates in Virginia or South Carolina. The chapel, while maintaining the appearance of a simple religious structure, was larger and more elaborate than its predecessor. Everything about the property spoke of tremendous wealth derived from criminal activities. Gabriel's initial conversation with Washington's team focused on legitimate slave trading opportunities. He described his methods for identifying and acquiring problem slaves who could be purchased at below market prices due to their behavioral issues. His approach involved buying these individuals using various techniques to break their resistance, then reselling them at significant profits to plantations that specialized in managing difficult workers. But as the conversation progressed, Gabriel began revealing more sensitive aspects of his operation. He mentioned his connections with medical schools that paid premium prices for fresh anatomical specimens. He described his information network that allowed him to identify potential escapees before they could reach Underground Railroad contacts. Most tellingly, he spoke about his theological research into the spiritual condition of people predestined for damnation. Washington recognized the same twisted religious justification that had characterized Gabriel's South Carolina operation. The man genuinely believed that he was doing God's work by hastening the deaths of souls that were destined for hell. Anyway, this theological framework allowed him to commit mass murder while maintaining his sense of moral superiority, and it provided the intellectual foundation for recruiting other Southern Christians into his criminal network. The tour of the plantation revealed the sophistication of the Alabama operation. The chapel's basement facility was far larger than its South Carolina predecessor, with individual cells designed for specific types of prisoners. Seraph's medical laboratory included equipment that would have been impressive in any legitimate medical school, along with detailed charts documenting the anatomical knowledge gained from his years of systematic torture. Most disturbing was the family's casual attitude toward their crimes. They spoke about their victims as if discussing livestock, using clinical language to describe torture techniques and disposal methods. Lilith demonstrated the equipment used to restrain prisoners, explaining how different configurations were optimal for different types of interrogation. Even Constance, who had seemed mentally fragile in South Carolina, now participated actively in discussions about the business aspects of their operation. Washington's team was invited to remain at the plantation for several days while Gabriel arranged for them to observe his methods firsthand. This extended visit provided unprecedented access to the family's operations, but it also placed the infiltrators in mortal danger. Any suspicious behavior would result in their immediate imprisonment and eventual death. The breakthrough came when Washington was allowed to participate in an interrogation session. Gabriel wanted to demonstrate his techniques for extracting information from captured escapees using a young man who had been caught attempting to reach Pennsylvania. The torture session was conducted with the same methodical precision that Washington remembered from his own captivity. But now he was able to observe Sharif's techniques from the perspective of an educated witness, rather than a helpless victim. VOA intelligence being extracted was staggering in its scope and detail. The prisoner was providing information about Underground Railroad safe houses, the names of conductors and sympathizers, the locations of hidden supply caches, and the identities of free black communities that provided assistance to escapees. This information was being compiled into detailed reports that were shared with slave catchers throughout the region, allowing for systematic destruction of the Underground Railroad network. But Washington also observed something that Gabriel apparently hadn't noticed. Subtle signs that the prisoner was providing false information mixed with genuine details. The young man was educated enough to understand what his captors wanted to hear and brave enough to misdirect their efforts. Even while enduring horrific torture, his resistance gave Washington hope that the Underground Railroad network was more resilient than Gabriel believed. Washington's extended stay at New Seraphim Implantation coincided with preparations for the annual gathering of the Southern Redemption Society. Gabriel was expecting nearly 30 members from across the Deep South, representing the largest assembly of the criminal network since its founding. The meeting would provide an unprecedented opportunity to document the conspiracy scope and identify key participants, but it would also place Washington's team in extreme danger. The society members began arriving in late December, traveling to the plantation under cover of attending a religious revival. Gabriel had publicized the event throughout Alabama and neighboring territories as a special Methodist conference focused on redemption theology and practical Christianity. Local newspapers carried advertisements for the revival, complete with testimonials from prominent planters about Gabriel's inspiring ministry. Washington recognized several attendees from his research into the network's operations. Dr. Edmund Thorne had returned from the Caribbean, apparently confident that enough time had passed since the Charleston incident to make his participation safe. Captain Fulton, the slave catcher who had disappeared after Morrison's investigation, was also present, having established new operations in Mississippi. Most shocking was the presence of Reverend Blackwood, who had supposedly found genuine religion after the South Carolina exposure. The attendees represented the criminal elite of the antebellum South. They included plantation owners who used their legitimate businesses to identify victims, merchants who provided transportation and financing, medical professionals who handled body disposal, and government officials who ensured that investigations were quashed or misdirected. Together, they controlled a network that extended from Virginia to Louisiana, processing hundreds of victims annually, while maintaining facades of respectability. The society's formal sessions were held in the plantation's main house, with discussions disguised as theological seminars on predestination and divine justice. But the real business was conducted in smaller groups where participants shared intelligence about Underground Railroad activities, coordinated responses to abolitionist investigations, and planned expansion into new territories. Washington's access to these conversations provided detailed documentation of criminal activities that exceeded anything previously gathered by law enforcement. Gabriel's opening address to the society revealed the scope of his ambitions. He spoke about expanding operations into the Louisiana Territory, where territorial status would provide even less oversight than Alabama. He described plans for new false sanctuaries in Mississippi and Tennessee, each designed to process larger numbers of victims more efficiently. Most chilling was his proposal for what he called industrial-scale redemption, facilities capable of killing and processing dozens of people simultaneously. Sarif's presentation on enhanced medical research demonstrated how far the family's criminal activities had evolved beyond simple murder for profit. He described experiments designed to test the limits of human endurance, procedures that provided anatomical knowledge unavailable through conventional means and techniques for preserving specimens that would maintain their research value during extended transportation. His work had attracted interest from medical schools in Europe, creating international markets for his products, but the society was facing growing pressure from abolitionist investigations and federal attention. Several members reported increased scrutiny from northern authorities, while others described difficulty maintaining their operations due to improved Underground Railroad security measures. The network's success had made it a target for systematic counteraction, and several participants expressed concern about their long-term safety. Washington's most important discovery was the society's plan for responding to increased pressure rather than reducing their activities. They intended to accelerate operations while developing new methods for avoiding detection. This included establishing legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for their criminal enterprises, corrupting additional government officials to ensure protection, and eliminating potential witnesses who might expose their activities. The elimination plan was particularly chilling. Gabriel had compiled a list of abolitionists, escaped slaves, and other individuals who posed threats to the network's security. The society intended to systematically murder these people using methods that would appear to be accidents, natural deaths, or random crimes. Washington's own name was on this list, along with Morrison and several other investigators who had been tracking the network's activities. But Washington had one advantage that Gabriel couldn't have anticipated. Morrison's team was already in position around the plantation, preparing for a coordinated assault that would expose the entire conspiracy. The timing had been carefully planned to coincide with the society's gathering when maximum numbers of criminals would be present and maximum evidence would be available for capture. The assault on New Seraphim Plantation began before dawn on January 15, 1808, when Morrison's team moved into position around the property's perimeter. The attack had been planned with military precision, taking advantage of detailed intelligence that Washington had provided about the plantation's layout, security measures, and the location of the underground prison facility. Federal marshals from New Orleans had agreed to participate, giving the operation legitimate law enforcement authority. The team included 24 men, Morrison and 7 other abolitionists, Samuel Washington and 3 other infiltrators, 8 federal marshals and 6 soldiers from the New Orleans garrison. They were armed with the latest military equipment and carried detailed maps of the plantation buildings. Most importantly, they had warrants signed by territorial judges who had been convinced that the Whitworth operation threatened federal authority in Alabama. The assault began with simultaneous attacks on the main house and the chapel, designed to prevent the destruction of evidence while capturing as many society members as possible. Morrison himself led the team that breached the chapel, where they discovered 17 prisoners in the underground facility. The condition of these captives provided horrifying testimony to the systematic torture that had been conducted in the basement chambers. Washington's role was to secure Gabriel's office in the main house where the family's detailed records were stored. Despite his years of preparation for this moment, nothing could have prepared him for the scope of documentation that Gabriel had maintained. Ledgers recorded over 1,500 murders. Correspondence revealed criminal partnerships extending to 12 states and 3 foreign countries, and detailed maps showed underground railroad routes that had been systematically compromised. The most damning evidence was Gabriel's personal journal, which provided theological justification for each murder while describing the profits generated by the operation. Gabriel had maintained meticulous records of every aspect of his criminal enterprise, apparently believing that divine approval for his actions required careful documentation of their religious necessity. The journal entries revealed a mind that had completely rationalized mass murder as an expression of Christian duty. Sif's medical laboratory yielded evidence of crimes that exceeded simple murder. His detailed research notes described experiments conducted on living subjects, procedures designed to test the limits of human endurance, and anatomical studies that violated every principle of medical ethics. The laboratory contained preserved specimens that would later provide definitive proof of systematic torture, along with correspondence with medical schools that had specifically requested such specimens. The capture of society members provided law enforcement with unprecedented access to the criminal network's leadership. Under interrogation, several participants revealed additional operations in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee. Others provided names of government officials who had been corrupted by the network, along with details about the methods used to ensure their cooperation. The testimony revealed a conspiracy that had penetrated every level of Southern society. Gabriel himself proved surprisingly cooperative once confronted with the evidence against him. Rather than denying his crimes, he attempted to justify them through elaborate theological arguments about predestination and divine justice. He seemed genuinely convinced that his actions had been morally correct, and he expressed pride in the efficiency and profitability of his operations. His complete lack of remorse made him perhaps the most chilling criminal in American history to that point. But the legal proceedings that followed demonstrated the limitations of early 19th century justice. While federal authorities had clear evidence of multiple murders, the jurisdictional complexities of territorial law made prosecution difficult. Several key witnesses disappeared before they could testify, apparently killed by remaining network members. Others recanted their testimony after receiving death threats or bribes from Southern sympathizers. Most frustrating was the reaction of local Alabama authorities who refused to cooperate with federal prosecutors. Territorial officials claimed that the evidence had been obtained illegally and that federal intervention in local criminal matters violated constitutional principles. Several prominent Alabama planters organized legal defense funds for the accused, arguing that they were victims of northern persecution rather than criminals deserving punishment. The legal proceedings against the Whitworth family and their Southern Redemption Society conspirators stretched on for 3 years, becoming a symbol of the growing tensions between North and South that would eventually lead to civil war. Gabriel Whitworth was ultimately convicted of murder and executed in 1811, but most of his family members and criminal partners escaped serious punishment through legal technicalities, witness intimidation, and political influence. Sheriff Whitworth fled to Mexico before he could be arrested, taking with him detailed medical records that he later sold to European researchers interested in his anatomical discoveries. His whereabouts remained unknown until 1834, when reports surfaced of a mysterious doctor in Texas who was conducting similar experiments on captured Comanche warriors. These reports were never officially confirmed, but they suggested that Sharif had continued his criminal research for decades after the Alabama operation was exposed. Ezekiel and the twins Cain and Abel were convicted of lesser charges and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. However, they were quietly released after serving only 2 years, apparently through the intervention of influential Southern politicians who viewed their prosecution as an attack on regional autonomy. All three resumed criminal activities under assumed identities, with Ezekiel establishing a new slave trading operation in Texas, and the twins operating a body-snatching enterprise that supplied medical schools throughout the Southwest. Miriam and Lilith used their beauty and social connections to avoid prosecution entirely. Miriam's husband, Captain Patterson, used his riverboat to transport both women to New Orleans, where they disappeared into the city's diverse population. Reports later placed them in Mexico City, where they had allegedly established a bordello that specialized in eliminating wealthy clients and selling their bodies to medical researchers. These reports were never verified, but they were consistent with the family's history of combining criminal activities with facades of respectability. Constance Whitworth, Gabriel's wife, was found mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to an asylum in Mobile. She died there in 1819, reportedly never having spoken a coherent word about her family's activities. Some observers believed her mental condition was genuine, while others suspected she was feigning insanity to avoid prosecution. The truth died with her, taking with it crucial details about the early development of the family's criminal enterprise. The exposure of the Whitworth network had far-reaching consequences for the Underground Railroad movement. The detailed intelligence that Gabriel had gathered about escape routes, safe houses, and Underground Railroad personnel forced abolitionists to completely reorganize their operations. Many routes that had been used successfully for years had to be abandoned, while trusted conductors and sympathizers found themselves under surveillance by slave catchers who had obtained their names from Whitworth records. But the exposure also galvanized Northern opposition to slavery by providing concrete evidence of the extremes to which the institution's defenders would go. Morrison's detailed reports about the Whitworth operation were published in newspapers throughout the North, generating support for abolition among Americans who had previously been indifferent to the slavery question. The systematic torture and murder conducted under the guise of religious ministry demonstrated that slavery corrupted not just economic relationships, but fundamental moral values. Samuel Washington became a prominent speaker for abolitionist organizations, using his first-hand experience of the Whitworth torture chambers to illustrate the human cost of slavery. His testimony was particularly effective with religious audiences who were shocked by the family's abuse of Christian theology to justify mass murder. Washington's speeches helped convince many Northern Christians that opposition to slavery was a religious obligation rather than merely a political preference. Jeremiah Morrison continued his investigation of criminal networks associated with slavery, eventually documenting similar operations in Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. His work established him as one of the most effective investigators of the antebellum period, and his methods influenced the development of modern criminal investigation techniques. However, the psychological toll of his work was enormous, and he died in 1825 at the age of 62, reportedly haunted by nightmares about the horrors he had witnessed. The New Seraphim plantation was abandoned after Gabriel's execution, with local residents claiming that the property was cursed by the suffering that had occurred there. The chapel was burned by person unknown in 1815, though the underground torture chambers remained intact beneath the ruins. The main house stood empty for decades before finally collapsing in a storm in 1847, leaving only the foundation stones as evidence of the Whitworth family's presence in Alabama. Modern historians estimate that the Whitworth family and their criminal network were responsible for the deaths of at least 1,800 people between 1789 and 1808. This number includes not only direct victims of their false sanctuary operations, but also the countless slaves who were captured and killed as a result of intelligence extracted through torture. The total death toll may have been significantly higher, as many of the family's records were destroyed before they could be examined by authorities. The Whitworth case represents one of the earliest documented examples of systematic murder conducted under the guise of religious ministry in American history. Gabriel's use of Christian theology to justify mass killing anticipated similar abuses by cult leaders and religious extremists in later centuries. His ability to maintain community support while conducting horrific crimes demonstrated the power of religious authority to corrupt moral judgment and enable criminal behavior. The medical aspects of the Whitworth operation revealed disturbing connections between legitimate academic institutions and criminal enterprises. Several prominent medical schools were found to have received specimens that they knew or should have known were obtained through murder. This discovery led to reforms in medical education and the establishment of ethical guidelines for anatomical research. Though enforcement remained inconsistent for decades, the network's sophisticated use of record-keeping and intelligence gathering anticipated modern organized crime methods by nearly a century. Gabriel's detailed documentation of victim backgrounds, underground railroad routes, and criminal profits demonstrated an understanding of systematic criminal enterprise that was unprecedented in early American history. His methods influenced later criminal organizations and provided law enforcement with insights into the structure and operation of conspiracy networks. Perhaps most significantly, the Whitworth case illustrated the inadequacy of early American legal institutions for dealing with crimes that crossed state boundaries or challenged regional political interests. The family's ability to escape serious punishment despite overwhelming evidence of their guilt demonstrated the need for stronger federal law enforcement authority and more consistent application of criminal justice principles. The case also revealed the extent to which slavery had corrupted Southern society by the early 19th century. The widespread support that the Whitworth family received from respectable planters, government officials, and religious leaders showed that the institution of slavery had created moral blindness that extended far beyond individual slaveholders. The systematic dehumanization required to maintain slavery had created conditions where mass murder could be rationalized as necessary for social order. The complete truth about the Whitworth family's crimes may never be known. Many of their records were destroyed during the legal proceedings, while others remain sealed in archives that have never been fully examined by historians. Local traditions in Alabama still speak of mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths that occurred during the family's residence in the territory. suggesting that their documented crimes represent only a fraction of their actual activities. Archaeological investigations of the new Seraphim plantation site have been limited by local opposition and legal complications involving property ownership. However, ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1990s revealed extensive underground structures that appear to match descriptions of the family's torture and disposal facilities. These findings suggest that the physical evidence of their crimes remains largely intact beneath decades of accumulated soil and vegetation. Recent research has also uncovered evidence of Whitworth family activities in Texas, Mexico, and possibly South America during the decades following their Alabama exposure. Ships' passenger lists, medical school records, and territorial government documents contain references to individuals using known Whitworth aliases who were involved in suspicious activities consistent with their established criminal methods. These discoveries suggest that the family's criminal enterprise may have continued operating under different identities long after the Alabama operation was exposed. The most disturbing possibility is that the Whitworth network represented only one example of similar criminal enterprises that operated throughout the antebellum South. The systematic nature of their operations, combined with the widespread support they received from respectable society, suggests that other families or organizations may have conducted comparable activities without ever being exposed. The historical record contains numerous references to mysterious disappearances, unexplained deaths, and suspicious religious movements that could indicate additional criminal networks. What remains certain is that the Whitworth family's story represents one of the darkest chapters in American religious history. Their systematic abuse of Christian theology to justify mass murder demonstrated how religious authority could be corrupted to serve criminal purposes. Their ability to maintain community support while conducting horrific crimes showed the extent to which slavery had poisoned American moral values by the early 19th century. The legacy of their crimes extends far beyond their immediate victims. The intelligence they gathered about underground railroad operations led to the capture and death of countless other escaped slaves whose names will never be known. Their corruption of medical education and research caused lasting damage to the integrity of American science. Most importantly, their success in avoiding punishment demonstrated to other criminals that systematic murder could be conducted with relative impunity if properly disguised and politically protected. Today, the site of the new Seraphim plantation remains largely forgotten, known only to local historians and the occasional researcher interested in the darker aspects of American history. No monument marks the location where over 1,000 people died in systematic torture and murder. No plaque commemorates the courage of the abolitionists who risked their lives to expose these crimes. The silence surrounding these events serves as a reminder of how easily societies can forget their most shameful episodes. But the story of the Whitworth family serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of religious extremism, racial hatred, and the corruption of moral authority. Their crimes demonstrate how quickly civilized societies can descend into barbarism when fundamental human values are abandoned in service of economic interests or political power. Understanding their story is essential for recognizing similar threats in our own time and ensuring that such systematic evil never again masquerades as divine will. The question that haunts everyone who studies this case is not whether the Whitworth family's crimes actually occurred. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. The real question is how many other similar operations existed throughout the antebellum period, how many victims died in similar circumstances, and whether the complete truth about this dark chapter in American history will ever be fully revealed. The shadows cast by the Whitworth legacy continue to obscure corners of our historical understanding, leaving us to wonder what other horrors remain hidden in the archives of America's past. In the end, The macabre history of the Whitworth family stands as testament to the human capacity for both ultimate evil and ultimate courage. While Gabriel and his family represent the depths of human depravity, the abolitionists who risked everything to expose their crimes embody the highest ideals of human dignity and moral courage. Their struggle reminds us that the price of civilization is constant vigilance against those who would use religious authority, political power, or social respectability to mask systematic cruelty. The chapel bells that once rang over the new seraphim implantation have long since fallen silent, but the echoes of their victims' suffering continue to resonate through American history until we fully confront the truth about crimes like those committed by the Whitworth family. We cannot claim to have honestly reckoned with our nation's past or adequately prepared ourselves to recognize similar threats in our future. What haunts you more that such systematic evil could operate under the guise of religious ministry? Or that so much of their story may still remain hidden in archives yet to be opened? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this dark chapter of American history has opened your eyes to the depths human beings can sink to when they abandon their moral compass, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Not everyone has the courage to face these hard truths about our past, but those who do join a community dedicated to ensuring that such horrors never happen again. Until next time, remember